The envelope was already open when Mirelle found it on her desk. She noticed it the same way she noticed everything in that office, because it was out of place, and out of place things cost money. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, the kind that came from a stationery store that didn't post prices in the window. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Not her full name. Just Mirelle, like whoever had left it already knew her well enough to skip the formality. Inside was a single card. 4 words. "You found the error." She turned the card over, nothing on the back. Mirelle set it down and pressed her palms flat against the desk. She had worked at Holt & Beckett Financial for 11 months. 11 months of arriving before everyone else and leaving after, of eating lunch at her desk, of catching mistakes that the senior analysts missed, and staying quiet about it because her contract was month to month, and her supervisor, a man named Prescott, who smelled like expensive cologne and mediocrity, had made it clear on her first week that she was replaceable. "The firm does you a favor by keeping you on," he'd said, not looking up from his phone. "Don't make me regret it." She was replaceable. She had heard that her whole life. The error she'd found wasn't small. It was the kind of error that kept auditors up at night. The kind buried in 6 layers of shell transactions across 4 accounts that didn't technically exist. She had found it by accident on a Wednesday afternoon, chasing a discrepancy of $42. $42 that led to $400,000, then $4 million, then something much larger than that, attached to a name she recognized from the news but had never expected to see in Holt & Beckett's client ledgers. Castellan, Mirelle had grown up in Sault-Ste. Marie, where her mother cleaned houses and her father, had disappeared so early she barely remembered what his voice sounded like. She'd put herself through night school, passed her CPA exams on the first try, and applied to 43 firms before Holt & Beckett gave her a provisional offer. She understood numbers the way other people understood words, not as symbols but as language. And the language in those accounts was telling her something very specific. Someone had been moving money for a very long time. Carefully, patiently. And someone at Holt & Beckett had been helping them do it. She should have reported it. She knew that. Instead, she'd printed the records, locked them in the bottom drawer of her desk under a battered copy of the CPA handbook, and told herself she needed to think. She hadn't told a single person. And yet the envelope had appeared. The meeting happened 2 days later. Not a meeting she scheduled. One that was scheduled for her. An appointment that appeared in her calendar at 7:40 in the morning with no organizer name, just a location, an address in the West End of Toronto she didn't recognize, and a time, 6 p.m., she almost didn't go. She sat on the subway, going north, and talked herself in and out of it 3 times. A sensible woman would not show up to an unmarked address because a mystery calendar invite told her to. A sensible woman would take the printed records to a lawyer, or the RCMP, or at minimum her landlord, who was also a retired accountant and probably had better advice than she did. Mirelle had been sensible her entire life, and it had gotten her a month-to-month contract and a supervisor who couldn't remember her last name. She got off at Lansdowne and walked. The building looked like a logistics company. No signage, dark windows, a metal door that buzzed open before she even knocked. Inside, a man in a dark jacket checked her bag without speaking and gestured her toward an elevator. The elevator required a key card. He used his own. The room she was brought to was not what she expected. She had braced for something cold, concrete floors, a single light, something out of a film where the woman who discovers too much ends up in a shallow grave somewhere north of Barrie. Instead, it was an office, a proper one, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a long oak desk, a window overlooking a courtyard where snow was just starting to fall. The kind of room that suggested someone had been here a long time and intended to stay. The man behind the desk didn't stand when she entered. He was older than she'd imagined, though she realized afterward she hadn't imagined anything specific. Mid-40s, maybe. Dark suit with no tie. Hair going grey at the temples. A scar that ran from the edge of his jaw toward his collar, disappearing into his shirt. His hands were folded on the desk, and he was watching her the way she'd seen auditors watch people. like he was already running calculations on something she couldn't see. "Sit down, Miss Joubert," he said. His name, she would learn later, was Castellan. Not a first name, just Castellan. And the way people said it, in the same breath they used for weather or inevitability, made her understand it was the only name that mattered. She sat. He said, "You found $42. "It turned into more than that," she said. "It did." He studied her for a moment. She studied him back, because she had learned young that looking away first was a form of surrender. "Most people who find what you found," he said, "do one of three things. They pretend they didn't see it. They report it to someone who tells them to pretend they didn't see it. Or they try to use it. You did none of those things." "I was still deciding," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like a recalibration. "That's honest. I try to be. Honesty is a liability in most situations," he said. "In accounting, it's a different matter." He opened a folder on the desk. She could see columns of numbers from where she sat, dense and precise. "You've been at Holt & Beckett for 11 months. Before that, Meridian Tax Services for 2 years. Before that, a bookkeeping position at a hardware chain that went into receivership. You finished your CPA while working full-time. You've applied for senior analyst positions at 6 firms in the last 8 months. All 6 rejected you." She kept her face still. "You're owed money from your last employer," he continued. "The hardware chain. 11 weeks of unpaid overtime. You never sued because you couldn't afford the legal fees. Is this the part where you explain how you know all this?" she asked. "No," he said. "This is the part where I make you an offer." The offer was not romantic. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own head, because she had a habit of tidying things into categories, and this needed to stay in the right one. It was a business arrangement, a contract. 36 weeks. She would work as the internal auditor for Castellan's operation. His legitimate operation, he'd specified, which covered property development, import logistics, and 3 charitable foundations she suspected were slightly more complicated than they appeared. She would find the errors, fix the errors, and keep her mouth shut about anything she wasn't paid to address. In exchange, a salary that made her momentarily lose her train of thought when he named it, enough to clear her student loans, enough to put something aside, enough to finally stop calculating exactly how many days of savings she had left if something went wrong. "And after 36 weeks?" she asked. "You walk away," he said, "with a reference I'll actually put my name to, and enough professional distance that no one can connect you to anything complicated. And if I say no..." He looked at her steadily. "Then you go back to Holt & Beckett, and the records you printed and locked in your bottom drawer disappear within the week. The error gets buried again. And in 3 months, Prescott fires you on a pretext, and you start the job applications over." She didn't ask how he knew about the bottom drawer. She already understood that asking how he knew things was probably not a productive use of anyone's time. "I'd want that in writing," she said. He produced a document from the folder. It was already drafted. She read the entire thing, every clause, every subclause. He waited without any sign of impatience, which she noted, because impatient people made sloppy agreements. She found 2 provisions she wanted amended and said so. He made a phone call. The amended version arrived by email within 8 minutes. She signed it. She still wasn't sure afterward if that was the bravest thing she'd ever done or the most foolish. Most days she suspected it was both. The work itself was not what she'd expected either. She had imagined something dramatic. Meetings in dim rooms, whispered conversations, the constant awareness of danger pressing against the windows. Instead, the first 3 weeks looked almost exactly like her old job. She sat at a desk. She read spreadsheets. She found where money went and made sure it arrived where it was supposed to, and left no interesting marks along the way. The office she worked from was in a building near King Street that served as the headquarters of a property development company called Crestway Holdings. The people around her were, as far as she could tell, entirely ordinary. An administrative assistant named Petra, who made exceptional coffee and had once, Mirelle discovered, worked for 2 federal cabinet ministers. A project manager named Okafor, who played podcast episodes about Canadian history at low volume and brought in baked goods every Friday. A lawyer named Renaud, who communicated almost entirely by email even when standing directly beside her. Castellan himself was rarely present. When he was, he moved through the office like a weather system. People adjusted around him without quite acknowledging that they were doing it. He stopped at her desk twice in those first weeks, once to ask a question about a contractor's invoice that had been coded wrong, once to leave a second coffee next to her existing one without explanation and walk away before she could say anything. She didn't thank him. She wasn't sure if that was the right call. The third week, she found something. It wasn't in the accounts she'd been assigned. It was in a subsidiary file she had technically been given access to, but hadn't been asked to review. A catering company under the Crestway umbrella that had filed invoices for events that didn't appear anywhere in the event calendar. She printed it. She sat with it for 2 hours. Then she walked down the hall and knocked on the door of the internal office, where Castellan worked when he was in the building. He looked up. She put the printout on his desk and said, "Someone inside is skimming. It's not much, 15,000–20,000 over 8 months, but the method is good enough that they thought you wouldn't notice." He looked at the printout for a long time. "You weren't assigned this file," he said. "No. Why were you in it?" "Because the catering invoices were cross-referenced to a venue account I was assigned, and the numbers didn't match, and I don't like it when numbers don't match." He was quiet. She had learned in those 3 weeks that his quiet was different from other people's quiet. It wasn't absence, it was calculation. "Sit down, Miss Joubert," he said. She sat. "The person who filed these invoices," he said carefully, "has been with this company for 6 years. "I know," she said. "I looked. And you're certain?" "I'm not certain of anything," she said. "That's not how accounting works. I'm showing you a pattern that has a very high probability of being intentional. What you do with it is your business." He looked at her again in that particular way he had. The auditor's look, she'd started calling it in her head, the look of someone running estimates on invisible variables. "Most people in your position," he said, "would have decided it was not their problem." "I'm not most people," she said. "And you hired me to find problems, so—" The corner of his mouth did something that was almost a smile. She went back to her desk. That night, on the subway home, she realized her hands had stopped shaking about 40 minutes into the conversation. She wasn't sure exactly when. She wasn't sure what that meant. The trouble started in week 7. She'd known there would be trouble. There was always trouble when a woman who was hired to look at numbers started finding things that other people had counted on, staying hidden. She had prepared herself for professional trouble. A complaint filed through the lawyer Renaud, a quiet suggestion that her contract might end early. She had not prepared for the other kind. The man who showed up at her apartment building on a Tuesday evening was not from Castellan's operation. She knew that because she had, by that point, a reasonable working knowledge of the people in Castellan's orbit. And this man wasn't one of them. He was broad-shouldered and wore a jacket that was too light for February in Toronto, and he stood in the lobby when she came in from the cold and said her name like it was a question. "Mrs. Joubert." She stopped. Her keys were in her hand. "I represent certain interests," he said, "who are concerned about the scope of your current employment." "I don't know what that means," she said. "I think you do," he said. He had an accent she couldn't quite place. Somewhere mid-Atlantic, somewhere practiced. "The people I represent are willing to make a generous offer for any documentation you may have gathered during your work at Crestway." Mirelle looked at him. She thought about the $42, the long chain that had followed it, the bottom drawer at Holton Beckett that she was now fairly certain had been emptied and re-examined by people she'd never met. "I don't have anything to offer you," she said. "I'm an internal auditor. I work with numbers." "We know what you work with," he said. "Then you know," she said steadily, "that I signed a confidentiality agreement, and that I take signed agreements seriously. Excuse me." She walked past him to the elevator. Her hands were completely still. She called the number on the business card Castellan had given her on her first day, a number she had not used once in 7 weeks. the moment the elevator doors closed. It rang once. "Monsieur Joubert," he said. "There's a man in my building," she said. "He said he represents certain interests. He wants documentation." A brief silence. "Are you in your apartment? Getting there?" "Lock the door," he said. "Don't open it. I'll send someone. I can manage. Lock the door," he said again. Not a shout. Something quieter than that, and more final. She locked the door. Someone arrived in 12 minutes. 2 of them, actually. One of whom she recognized from Crestway, a quiet man who went by the name Tillett, and who had, on 2 separate occasions, fixed the printer when the office tech support was unavailable. He checked her building, came back, and told her simply that the man in the lobby had gone. She didn't sleep much that night. Castellan came himself the following morning. He arrived at her apartment at 7:15 with a coffee from the place 2 blocks down, the one she went to on Wednesdays, which meant he either lived nearby or had been paying a particular kind of attention. She let him in because she was already awake, and because she was not, at her core, a person who turned away information. He sat at her kitchen table. He looked tired in a way that she understood was probably not new. The kind of tired that had settled in so long it had become structural. She sat across from him with her own coffee and waited. "The people who contacted you last night," he said, "are a competing interest. They've been attempting to access my operation's financial records for some time. They were not aware that I'd changed my internal audit structure." He paused. "They are now, because of me, because of the catering invoices," he said. "The person you identified had a secondary relationship with this competing interest. When I addressed it, they moved quickly." She processed this. "So by doing my job," she said slowly, "I became a target. Yes, that's not in my contract." "No," he said, "it isn't." He set his coffee down and looked at her directly. "I'm prepared to renegotiate." She looked at him across the table. In her kitchen, with February light coming through the window and the radiator making its irregular ticking sound, he looked less like something from a news article and more like a tired man who had been running a complicated system for a very long time and was accustomed to solving problems without anyone's help. She thought about her mother's hands, the lines in them from other people's cleaning products. She thought about the 43 job applications, the 42 rejections, the night school textbooks she'd sold off one by one when the money got thin, the hardware chain that had stolen 11 weeks of her time and she'd had no recourse. She had spent 31 years being reasonable about what she was owed. "Tell me what renegotiating looks like," she said. "You move out of this apartment," he said, "temporarily. The building I own on Richmond has a unit that's been empty since November. You continue your work. You have a security detail that you will find less intrusive than you're imagining, and your salary increases by 30% for the remainder of the contract." She looked at him for a long time. "I pick my own coffee," she said. He blinked, just slightly. "The coffee you brought is fine," she clarified, "but the place on Adelaide is better, and if I'm temporarily relocating, I need to know the parameters of temporarily." Something in his face did the almost smile again. "Until the competing interest issue is resolved," he said, "I'd estimate 4 to 6 weeks, and the 30% increase starts immediately." From today, she drank her coffee. She looked at the contract in her head, all its clauses, all its sub-clauses, the 2 she'd had amended. She was good at contracts. She was good at seeing where the risk actually lived versus where people said it lived. "All right," she said. The unit on Richmond was the nicest place she had ever lived. She would not say that out loud because it felt like a concession of some kind, but it was true. High ceilings, a kitchen with a gas stove, a window seat in the bedroom where the light came in at exactly the angle that made reading comfortable. She sat in it the first night and felt the particular loneliness of being somewhere too good for your current situation, which was a specific feeling she had a lot of practice managing. She managed it by working. She always had. Castellan was more present during those weeks. He came to the Richmond building sometimes, or she saw him more at Crestway. She wasn't sure which had changed, whether her circumstances had, or just her awareness of him. She started to understand the way he operated, not dramatically, not with the theatrical menace she might have imagined, but methodically, patiently. He kept ledgers, not literally, though he did have an exceptional system for documentation. He tracked what was owed to him and what he owed, and he balanced those accounts as carefully as she balanced the financial ones. She understood that kind of thinking. She had been keeping her own version of that ledger her entire life. One evening in week 10, she worked late at the Crestway office, and he was there when she finally closed her files. Not waiting for her, precisely, just still there, jacket off, reading something on his tablet at the table in the corner of the main boardroom they'd started using as an informal workspace. She got her coat. She stood at the door. "Castellan," she said. He looked up. "The competing interest situation," she said. "How complicated is it, actually?" He considered the question with the same attention he gave everything. "Complicated," he said. "Not unmanageable. If you need me to look at the financial architecture," she said. "I want to. I know the accounts well enough now that I'd probably spot things faster than anyone starting fresh." He was quiet. "That's not in my contract either," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't. So consider it a voluntary contribution," she said. "I don't like leaving things unfinished. It goes against my nature." He looked at her the way he sometimes did, that calculation happening somewhere behind his eyes, the one she'd stopped trying to decode, because she suspected it was just how he processed the world. "You're not afraid of this," he said. "Not a question." "I'm afraid of a lot of things," she said honestly. "I'm afraid of going back to applying for jobs that don't call me back. I'm afraid of another month-to-month contract with someone like Prescott, who doesn't know my last name. I'm afraid of ending up at 60 with exactly what I have now, which isn't much." She paused. "This?" She gestured at the room, at the implicit everything. "This is just a problem. I'm good at problems." The room was quiet. "Sit down," he said. She sat down. He opened a different file on the tablet and turned it toward her. "Tell me what you see," he said. She looked at it. Numbers, columns, a structure she recognized because she'd seen its shadow in the account she'd been working with for 10 weeks. She reached across and scrolled without asking permission, which she realized afterward was perhaps a little bold. He didn't say anything about it. She looked for a long time. She found 3 things she thought were significant. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which remained one of the things she appreciated most about him. He actually listened, in the way that rare people did, as though what she was saying might be of use. When she finished, he said, "The third one. You're sure?" "No," she said. "I'm never sure. But the pattern is consistent with concealment, and the timing lines up with something I flagged in the Crestway West accounts in week 4. Do you want me to build the comparison?" "Yes," he said. She pulled her laptop back out of her bag. She worked for another hour and a half. He worked across from her. The building emptied around them. She heard Okafor say goodnight at some point, and Renault's distinctive footstep pattern heading for the elevator. The snow started again outside the boardroom window. At some point, Tillett appeared with sandwiches from somewhere and set them on the table and left without a word. She ate half of one without looking up. She was aware that Castellan ate his entirely, and that he also ate half of her second half, which she had pushed to the side of her laptop, and she chose not to remark on it. She found the connection at 11:47 p.m. She showed him. He looked at it. "Yes," he said quietly. "It won't be easy to prove in a way that serves your purposes," she said. "But it shows where the leverage is." He leaned back in his chair. He rubbed the sit of his jaw, the side without the scar. And she understood this was a thinking gesture, that it meant something was being weighed. "You understand," he said slowly, "that what you've just done puts you further into this than your contract anticipated." "I know," she said, "and you did it anyway. I told you already," she said. "I don't like leaving things unfinished." He looked at her. Not the auditor's look this time. Something different. Something she didn't have a category for yet. "The competing interest," he said, "will be resolved within the week. After that, your current living situation." "I know," she said. "I go back to my apartment." "Yes," he said, "if that's what you want." She looked at her laptop, at the columns of numbers that had somehow become, over 10 weeks, a language she spoke more fluently than she'd spoken anything in years, at the snow outside the window. "I might be interested," she said carefully, "in a contract extension, if the terms were right." The almost smile again, less almost this time. "What terms would that be, Miss Joubert?" "Fair ones," she said. "I'd want them in writing." "Of course," he said. The snow kept falling. Outside, Toronto went on being cold and large and indifferent, the way it always was, the way she had always moved through it, carefully, precisely, adding everything up. She had spent her whole life trying to make the numbers balance. For the first time in a long time, she thought they might.